speaking, although I want to qualify that in a moment or so. When I speak of the very nature of the form, I'm really speaking of an indirect critique, just by its mere publication and existence it critiques. But when that need has been stronger, literary journalism has often provided a more direct comment or critique of conventional, or in the 1890s in the United States, an emerging conventional journalism. And I think it is worth noting a few examples. For instance, in Stephen Crane's New York Press article, published in 1894, When a Man Falls, a Crowd Gathers, Crane calls into question what is becoming the substance of much urban newspaper reporting in America, the who, what, where. And he does this by stating that those calling for such information had, quote, magnificent passions for abstract statistical information. So rather than providing useful concrete facts by providing the who, what, where, Crane suggested that such details were just the opposite. They were abstract. More than 40 years later, James Agee was even more direct and blunt, and let us now praise famous when he said, who, what, where, when, and why, or how is the primal cliché and complacency of journalism, and that the very blood and semen of journalism is a broad and successful form of lying, end of quote. And 32 years later than that, Norman Mailer's opening to his classic work of literary journalism, The Armies of the Night, begins this way. From the outset, let us bring you news of your protagonist, Mailer. And then Mailer provides, word for word, an account from Time magazine. But then he follows the Time magazine account with this declaration. Now we may leave Time in order to find out what happened. So if you want the real news, you better get it somewhere else. About the same time as Mailer, or a few years later, Mike O'Hare, in his collection of Vietnam dispatches, he openly critiqued the news media several points in the book. For instance, when he sees this large group of journalists, correspondents returning from a daily briefing that was given by the U.S. military, he calls the briefing, quote, the standard diurnal informational freakorama, 5 o'clock follies, jive at 5, war stories, end of quote. And then he has those reporters going, quote, to their offices to file the wasted clocking the wasted, end of quote. At another point, he writes, quote, the press got all the facts, more or less. It got too many of them. But it never found a way to report meaningfully about death, which of course was really what it was all about. And Harry goes on to say that the news media in Vietnam was missing, quote, a story that was as simple as it had always been. Men hunting men, a hideous war, and all kinds of victims. Now for these writers, and I think for many literary journalists, events and facts are anything but straightforward, but are, as Crane said more than 100 years ago, abstract. Didion suggests as much in Salvador when she refers to having attempted to capture, quote, elusive shadows, and rather than the kind of detail that is supposed to illuminate the story. When Hare, Didion, Mailer, even Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc and Trina share their frustrations in getting the truth, in getting the story in a traditional sense or in their non-traditional sense. And when they allow us to participate in the coverage itself, or when Mailer or Thompson or Conover become characters in their pieces and use first-person narratives, they are not only questioning conventional journalism claims to unassailable facts and truth with a capital T, they're questioning that, but they are providing that counter-narrative that by its very existence and by its publication provides critique. Certainly such approaches automatically call into question what we know and how we know. As paradoxes and uncertainties emerge in this kind of writing, the legitimacy of facts are thereby questioned. These uncertainties and paradoxes, unlike so much of the content of conventional journalism, give us a slippery and shifting reality, rather than reality with a capital R, single and simplified. They give us something different. These works stand in contrast in a most striking fashion to conventional journalism's certainties and truth claims, just by letting us see how the material was gathered and how the writer responded to the material, to the people, to the scenes, and to the situations encountered and observed. They let us see how narratives were created, brought into existence. And in doing so, they declare that what we are getting is just one version of reality. As one of my students said this past semester, undergraduate student, in response to a Susan Orlean piece, she said, one reason her style of writing is so good and effective is because she acknowledges her own existence. And when I first read that, I said, duh. But then when you think about that a moment, that's pretty striking, and I think a perceptive comment on what separates these two. Now, as striking and contrary as it might be to have a writer or journalist acknowledge her own existence when compared to more conventional American journalism's faceless reporters and narrators, I don't mean to suggest that writers who avoid being part of the story or who do not allow us to see the challenges in their reporting and the birthing of their narratives, I don't mean to suggest that they are not providing an alternative to conventional journalism. I think even writers who would say, as Tom Wolfe once said, or who believe that they can capture reality, that they can represent reality accurately, even those writers can say with Wolfe, come here, look! This is the way people live these days. These are the things they do. And then point to an article or book as depicting life being lived. Even these writers who believe such writing can be a mirrored reflection of reality, even the work of these writers provides a counterpoint by its very nature. Now, as already suggested, it does so because the range and depth of rhetorical strategies, somewhat called these literary devices, employed in the finest literary journalism, those very methods, those strategies, are counter to what is employed most of the time in conventional journalism. Now, you're all familiar with these devices, strategies. Some of them were mentioned today, all part of a good writer's toolkit. But I just want to, rush through them a bit, again, kind of acknowledging and reaffirming some things that we all might already understand or know. But here's some stuff on that list. Metaphor and symbolism, repetition of words or images that set a tone, create an atmosphere, help establish or reinforce themes. Imagery, particular imagery that connects to the senses. Characterization. In fact, the writer, as we've already noted, could maybe even be a character himself or herself. Framing very much goes along with the comments on the structure of a piece. Framing that structure, I'm thinking of something very basic, such as Lillian Ross using the yellow school bus and the yellow bus coming into the city at the beginning and the bus is leaving at the end. Or Jane Kramer in The Last Cowboy, when she talks about it, the first paragraph of her book talks about that this is going to be a day of deception, and she talks about the rattlesnakes crawling in the grass, and the book ends with Henry Blanton, the cowboy, being sadly deceived and misled and lied to, and he does something very cowardly and dastardly in the process because of that. So that kind of framing to the piece, or Sarah Davidson's Real Property piece, where we have a quest narrative, a kind of structure that begins with the quest for meaning. What is the meaning of life? She's in search of a guru, and she finds her guru, a homeless, drunken bum that she runs over in her driveway. Narrative perspective, point of view, which may change from article to article, from book to book, and often even shifts within an article or within a book. Use of contrast, that was alluded to today. Stephen Crane was a lover of contrast, consistently, effectively. One of my favorite literary journalists from the 1930s, Martha Gellhorn, was terrific with contrast. In her piece, The Third Winter, she says in Barcelona it was perfect bombing weather. The cafes along the Rambla were crowded, and she goes on that way. But the whole piece has those kinds of images, including the most striking one is when she depicts a mother as a witch trying to unsuccessfully comfort her child injured by bombing. And I'm not ashamed to make a confession here about Martha Gellhorn, that if she were still living and she were not married and I wasn't, I'd ask her to marry me. That's the point. Irony and satire, structure that varies, we just talked about that. Shifting rhythm for effect. Reinventing taking